Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss how the Brexiteers actually got it right and the EU are collapsing with their strong growth this year across sectors as they emerge from the economic fallout of the pandemic, and how Britain is just going from strength to strength with our knackered recovery hit by Brexit fuel shortages of workers in key industries. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So you may have detected a tone of sarcasm in my voice there. There are multiple reasons why certain architects of Brexit persuaded us that we needed to leave the EU, of course. All of them need to be tackled in order to get enough of the public ready for a return. It will take time because some of the Brexiteers' predictions take longer than others to expose. One such justification was that the EU was failing and we didn't want to be caught in the implosion. In fact, outside the EU, a massive UK economy would be in pole position to become dominant in Europe as the economic destruction wrought by the collapse in EU took its toll everywhere else. It seems to be absolutely vital to some Brexit supporters that this is what happens. They seemed happy to accept that the UK should be part of a strong EU. You know, they got that trading outside the bloc would be problematic. Oh, absolutely. I mean, if the EU didn't collapse, it would be stupid to leave. But it's going to collapse. It has to collapse. Their entire Brexit strategy is centred around the idea of there being no major trading bloc in Europe. And that thought process has always confused me. See, the EU is the progression of a pioneering experiment which began in the aftermath of the Second World War, to promote peace amongst powerful nations who, let's face it, had been knocking lumps out of one another for millennia. It made them all much wealthier than not being part of this group. So other countries around the world looked at this and saw the future of prosperity. There are trading blocs around the globe now, providing more power to individual nations, even powerful nations, than they would otherwise have in international trade negotiations with each other. This is the pattern of the world now. You don't negotiate trade with Germany, you negotiate with basically Europe. Those who keep trying to say that we managed all right before joining are wrong for two reasons. One, we weren't all right. That's why we joined. We've always been standoffish about the political project, but we didn't like the fact that our economy was struggling while EEC members were doing much better. The other point is, back then, most nations negotiated purely for themselves. You know, if that doesn't happen now, if you negotiate a trade agreement with Japan, you were negotiating a trade agreement with Japan. Oh, but didn't we negotiate a trade deal with Japan recently? A good case in point, no, we didn't. The Japanese negotiations were framed around Japan's trading relationships with their major partners. For example, the quotas we have with Japan are not our quotas at all. We have the leftovers from the EU. So basically the way it works is, if the EU meet their quota for a particular type of export, we can't actually export any of it to Japan because the EU's used it all first. You know, they are first in line. You know, even though we have a deal for it. It's just so happens that what we do export, Europe's not going to export that much. But if they decided to increase it, if there was a sudden increase in demand in Japan and Europe felt, well, we could supply that demand, we'd be frozen out. We didn't negotiate a trade agreement with Japan in isolation. We created one that fit in the gaps between the ones they have with the EU and their more local RCEP, you know, the Pacific Nations Group. Why would an experiment that has worked time and again suddenly fall with no warning at all? And that's another question I've never seen answered. Why do they think the EU is collapsing? Yeah, I mean, every now and then you get some people, oh, they're going into recession. Oh, that's it now. They're going over the edge. But it's like, yeah, recessions happen all the time. We have this cycle of growth and contraction. You know, they soon pipe down when they return back to growth, don't they? You know, is it because the EU is losing influence on the world stage? Is that why they're about to collapse? Because that's really important. No, they've grown it. They've grown since 2016. Don't get me wrong. The UK leaving the EU has left a huge gap in its buying power. Absolutely ridiculous to say that the EU hasn't even noticed the UK leaving. That's a nonsense. Brexit is an ill wind that blew nobody any good. Maybe Putin and some disaster capitalists. But the EU is larger now than it was in 2016 in terms of its free trade area. The trade agreements that have come online since then have more than made up for the UK's exit. But where has our compensation for leaving the largest free trade area in the world gone? Where's that? What did we get out of it? But still, they bang on about the EU collapsing. The latest one that I can recall a couple of weeks ago, the Express, good old Express, saying that the EU risks collapse again. This time it was highlighting the problems with Poland and Hungary's autocratic behaviour. And yes, that's a crisis. Absolutely, that's a crisis. Are the EU dealing with it? I don't know. They don't seem to be dealing with it terribly well. But the way I see the EU, it's a little bit like I see the Conservative Party in this country. Which doesn't sound like a very nice comparison, but let me explain. During Brexit, as the Tories were splitting over Europe, as they often do, people looked on from the outside in anticipation of the party collapsing. The Conservatives will be wiped out. They're all going to implode with their own stupid Brexit. It was never going to happen. Other political parties in the UK can collapse. There are circumstances that could cause the end of Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP, Plaid, all of them. None of them are imminent. That's not going to happen anytime soon. I don't even expect it to happen in the foreseeable future. But it could happen. It's possible. The Conservatives will be around forever. And I don't mean that because they're the only party that's been around for centuries. I mean because they are the billionaires' only route to control in this country. If a party has the funding, it will continue. Whereas the other parties have to be funded by, to a certain extent, their success. They have to persuade people they're worth funding. Conservatives, they'll need a small number of people to get them through. This control was evident during the last days of Theresa May. The wealthy party backers didn't like her stance, and so they pulled the funding. Conservative Party was in real trouble. Then Boris Johnson stepped in, was suitably insane, and they turned the money tap back on. Well, the EU is a bit like that. It is so beneficial to its members, it will not be allowed to collapse. In fact, Brexit actually strengthened the relationship. People around other EU countries saw what a shit show Brexit has been for Britain and decided they didn't really fancy a dose of the same. Yes, some things that the EU Commission does drives you crazy. Does me. Of course, there will be times when your country is overruled by the others and you think, well, that's just silly. But the net benefit is so obviously huge that it will survive crisis after crisis. It provides power and wealth that is simply unachievable in isolation. And we are highlighting that as well. The Eurozone is growing again. I mean, everyone in Europe is growing after last year's pandemic economic nightmare. The UK is growing as well. But whereas the growth in the powerhouse of the EU is quite strong, ours has been blunted severely. As a percentage, our growth was looking really good, sort of. In the second quarter of this year, growth is reckoned to be about 4.8%. In a random year, and that's only one quarter, that would be spectacular. But of course, it's because our recession was the worst of all advanced economies last year that such growth is not actually as great as it looks. Because you go 4.8% growth in that quarter. Wow, that's brilliant. But we shrank by 9.9% last year. Oh, okay, that's the old losing a quid and finding a penny, isn't it? But it looks like the overall growth forecast of 7% for the year, even that doesn't compensate for last year. But even that's been downgraded because of our Brexit-inspired shortages hitting the economy. Because the third quarter's not been looking so rosy. You know, it was already hampered by our hit to exports as a result of Brexit trade barriers. But we can't even sell as much to ourselves as we would like. The successful Euros football tournament, that provided a big old boost to the infection rate as well. But we're slumping again. Shortages don't just mean consumers can't get as much stuff. It also means we don't spend as much money. If we can't get what we want, we don't spend it. Some people spend it on something else. A lot of people just go, I can't get what we want. You know, sure, there'll be price rises to compensate, but still, you know, if people go into McDonald's and can't get the milkshake, they don't think, I've got all this money I was going to spend on a milkshake. I'll just spend it on a Whisper bar or something. People just go, I wanted a milkshake, I can't have a milkshake, so I just won't have a milkshake. And if we don't spend as much money, the government doesn't take in as much VAT, for example. But the question is, what does it take to persuade the people who need it that their wet dream of an EU collapse isn't happening? Because there's no pressure on EU growth that doesn't already exist in Britain. If they're going to try and say it's an economic collapse, nothing's happening in the EU that isn't also happening in Britain. Plus, we have our own extra as well. The pandemic continues to affect global output. Remember, the world in general is not vaccinating at the same rate as Europe. But we need the whole world to be vaccinated before we can actually move on properly from the pandemic. But we have cut ourselves off from a large part of our pre-Brexit workforce. And also consider this. So it's not just that because we're missing those workers, they're not producing stuff, so we can't buy it, so the government doesn't raise as much VAT. Those workers aren't working, so they're not paying tax, so the government also doesn't take in as much income tax and national insurance. And we've made it more difficult to export to our most important market as well. So again, that's more jobs not really needed, fewer taxes being paid. And of course, it's impossible to sell some goods at all. So the fact that although there are pressures on growth throughout Europe, and indeed the world, we are the only part of the world that is having to cope with all of those things, plus suddenly increasing our own trade barriers as well. And we aren't even finished with that. Normal political wisdom may no longer hold sway on our little plague island, but the laws of economics are not so easily broken. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.